Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new video, and I haven't done a what if in a while, so today we're going to be doing what if Republicans stayed progressive. We're going to be starting from the years of 1912 and we're going to go to the modern day, you know how we do it. So essentially it's going to be another version of what if Teddy Roosevelt stayed president, but the Republicans stayed progressive in this timeline. So in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt will defeat William Taft, and instead of Democrats becoming progressive as well, they will stay as a Bourbon Democrat under Grover Cleveland. And the Democrats would nominate Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House, as the Democrat nominee, and Teddy Roosevelt would go on to defeat Champ Clark 387 to 144 to win re-election as the 28th president. And during this term, he would set up recall elections for senators, House representatives. Well, actually, he wouldn't do this because he'd be too busy with the war. However, I do think we'd get some sort of Social Security involved, like established in the country about 40, 30 years before FDR establishes it because he got it from Teddy Roosevelt, since most of Teddy's time would be dealing with World War I, and Teddy would be a lot more hands-offish in the war, so we would prevent Hitler, the rise of Hitler, as well, so there would be no World War II going into this time. In 1916, Teddy Roosevelt would not run again. It would be Hiram Johnson. Hiram Johnson would um, be nominated by Republicans, and Democrats would nominate Ohio Governor Judson Harmon. Hiram Johnson would go on to defeat Judson Harmon 330 to 201. This is where we get a lot more of that progressive, a lot more progressive policies coming down, uh, coming along. We probably get recall elections for senators and governors and House representatives as well as judges. We'd absolutely get some form of health care. It'd be a very small healthcare package considering it's 1916 and there really isn't much to do in the healthcare industry. Um, and I think we would also get retirement pensions as well, and the economy would do very well heading into the 1920 election, where Democrats would nominate Oklahoma Senator Robert Owen. This is going to be the rise of essentially the fall of Burma Democrats and the rise of the Southern conservative Democrat establishment in the South. And it would start with Oklahoma Senator Robert Owen. So imagine this Confederate, Dixiecrat, even Dixiecrat Democrats essentially. Hiram Johnson would go on to defeat Robert Owen because Hiram Johnson's very popular. The economy's doing great. A lot of social programs have been implemented. In 1924, the Republicans would nominate Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette, and the Democrats would nominate, I believe, Virginia Senator Pat Harrison. I believe it's Virginia. I could be wrong. But after 12 years of Republican rule, despite the economy doing well, Pat Harrison would narrowly defeat Robert La Follette to become the 30th president. And here we get a lot of, a lot of we get tax cuts as well. Maybe, a shrinkage in the social programs that the Republicans implemented the past 12 years. Going on to 1928, Pat Harrison would go on to face the former Commerce Secretary under the Johnson administration, Herbert Hoover. Pat Harrison would defeat Herbert Hoover 296 to 235 to win re-election. Still a narrow victory for Pat Harrison. Harrison would not support prohibition. The Democrats would be the party against prohibition, so prohibition is never passed in this timeline. And also, there would be a early amendment to limit the president to 2 terms after Roosevelt. It would be passed during this administration here. Going on to 1932, Republicans nominate Charles Curtis, and of course, the Great Depression is starting, so Harrison's approval ratings in the low 30s, high 20s. The Democrats nominate Speaker John Garner sort of as a sacrificial lamb to Charles Curtis, who's very popular as a senator. He would be elected 400 to 131 to become the 31st president, and Charles Curtis would become the first minority elected as president, to be the first Native American president and the first minority ever elected back in 1932. So that is something interesting to think about. And under this term, we'd probably get, a gambling act from Charles Curtis. Charles Curtis was very favorable of legalizing gambling federally in the United States. We'd probably get this, which is a big boost to the economy. Native American reservations probably get a lot more funding, which again boosts the economy. I would imagine a lot more. I'd imagine similar New Deal programs. I want a gas tax holiday would probably occur during this time, so gas is a bit cheaper. Going on to 1936, Charles Curtis again. The depression much the effect of the depression has lessened by a lot, but at this time, but Charles Curtis is going on against the a New York Congressman, Henry Breckinridge, who is related to former Vice President John C. Breckinridge, by the way. Henry Breckinridge really stands no chance against Charles Curtis, and Charles Curtis beats him 514 to 17. Breckinridge would, have Southern appeal because of his lineage, but he'd be a New York congressman. He'd probably be very unpopular outside of the South, except in his district. But again, we probably get a lot more of a similar progressive New Deal kind of elements. I don't want to say it's exactly like the New Deal because Social Security is already a thing. Um, the We probably have a tax on like tobacco products and marijuana products, like FDR did. But of course, the Great Depression is essentially gone by the time we get to 1940, which we would have Republican businessman Wendell Willkie be given the nomination. Again, Wendell Willkie, a very progressive Republican. During his time, he supported most of FDR's New Deal programs. Cordell Hull, the senator from Tennessee, would be elected. He'd be very moderate, unlike a conservative, so he'd have to choose conservative Alabama Senator William Bankhead as his running mate. However, Willkie, with the massive popularity of the Republican Party right now, would defeat Cordell Hull 418 to 113 to become the 32nd president, and would continue with the progressive social programs going forward. Um, I just let you imagine this. We again, more social programs would be established. Maybe those shrinkages of healthcare and Social Security would probably be increased instead of shrinked from the Harrison administration. Wendell Willkie, the economy doing good heading into 1944. Wendell Willkie will be facing off against Virginia Senator Harry Byrd. Again, a very conservative Democrat, very far right. He would choose North Carolina Senator Prentice Cooper as his running mate. However, Willkie would still beat Harry Byrd 396 to 135 to win re-election. And this is where the Republican popularity starts to wave a bit as we head into the 1948 election, where Democrats nominate South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond, who has a very high amount of white working class support for some reason. And Democrats would nominate a very popular governor out of Minnesota, Harold Stassen, who is just old enough to run. He's the youngest nominee ever. And Strom Thurmond would attack him for his inexperience, despite him being in politics for over 2 decades at this point. Uh, Strom Thurmond would choose West Virginia Governor or Senator Harley Kilgore, and Harold Stassen would choose New York Governor Thomas Dewey as his running mate. Again, this is We've had 16 years of Republican rule. Voters are swinging over to Strom Thurmond because they want to change. Strom Thurmond does promise not to shrink any of the social programs that's passed under the Curtis and Willkie administrations, which does give him some support. And Thurmond does end up winning the election 310 to 221 to become the 33rd president. Here we'd see a lot of we see a poll tax increase in federal, which does lower turnout. However, it is supposed to be a incentive for minorities not to vote. Segregation would be enhanced as well. We'd see a lot of racist policies under the Thurmond administration, with a lot of backing from the South as well. Going on 1952, the Republicans would nominate a former general, Dwight Eisenhower, who would go up against Strom Thurmond, who has an approval rating in the mid to low 40s. And mostly from the north, as you can see off this map here, as he does very well in the south, not so much in the north, as Eisenhower does beat him 395 to 136 to become the 34th president. So Thurmond becomes the first one-term president since William Taft, and he only became one-term president because Roosevelt primaried him. Going on 1956, this election is very similar to the IRL election, except Stevenson does a little bit better. This is kind of a return to the Bourbon Democrat, as, of course, he has to pick Estes Kefauver as his running mate to keep the Southern establishment on his side. But Eisenhower still beats Stevenson in this timeline by a very large margin. Again, we'd have Eisenhower, we'd have the Korean War happen. The Korean War would be a success in this timeline under Eisenhower, like it was IRL. Going on 1916, a very tight election. Republicans nominate New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller over the Vice President. Nixon isn't seen as progressive enough for the white working class voters that are on the Republican side, as well as minorities, which minorities are heavily Republican still in this timeline. and Rockefeller would be nominated. And the Democrat Southern establishment would push Lyndon B. Johnson up to the nomination. And we all know that Johnson would be seen as conservative, but he was secretly very progressive for his time. However, Rockefeller would go on to narrowly defeat, well, not narrowly, because he wins by a landslide. Rockefeller beats Johnson, and by 354 to 182 to become the 35th president. In this term, we see we see the Civil Rights Act passed. Racial segregation is banned. Um, Busing is still included. It'd be a lot more progressive than it was IRL. We'd see forced integration, which very unpopular in in certain areas, especially in the South, and even in the North a little bit. Forced integration is not that popular in the North, uh, but it was still something that happened. We'd see busing happen here. Um, the poll tax would be banned outright here, as there wouldn't be an amendment for the poll tax. Poll tax would just be banned outright in the Civil Rights Act. I'm sure you can think of more that would happen in this bill, but it'd be a lot more progressive, and Republican and black vote and minorities is more integrated into society this way, especially with the social programs that is passed under the Curtis and Willkie administrations. And as you going forward, the Republican or the black vote is around 55 to 45 Republican. It's sometimes 60 to 40. So black voters are very heavily Republican in this timeline. Going on to 1964, Nelson Rockefeller would go up against George Wallace, and George Wallace, again, campaigning on racial segregation. It's kind of seen as a last-ditch effort by the Democrats to get rid of the Civil Rights Act, but Nelson Rockefeller would essentially sweep every part of the country except a few states in the South against George Wallace and beats him to win re-election. Uh, there would be no Vietnam War. Rockefeller would not send the United States into the Vietnam War. He would try to peacefully negotiate things out of war, in which he does successfully, so we don't go into war. Going in 1968, the Democrats nominate the governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who does not become a Republican in this timeline due to the fact that Republicans have become super economically progressive, and Reagan is more free markets kind of guy, so he would stay with the Democrats. And the Democrats are pretty much his thing. It's like he wouldn't have supported the Civil Rights Act. He would have wanted a more moderate Civil Rights Act, similar to Barry Goldwater in our timeline. And the Republicans nominate Michigan Governor George Romney as the nominee. He was a very fresh face in the scene, very popular in his state. But Reagan would go on to defeat Romney. Again, the whole 16 years of Republican rule. So the independents want change, and that change is Ronald Reagan. So we would essentially get Reagan's first term in 1980 right now. Of course, we had the recession that happened about a year or two before in 1966, 1967. So we'd have Reagan do well with the economy, would get tax cuts, trickle down economics would take effect. Of course, we'd probably get a nuclear arms deal with a country, probably not Iran, but maybe a European country or maybe even Canada. So we would get that, nuclear deal with Ronald Reagan still. And going forward to 1972, Reagan, super popular, is going up, kind of a inverse 1972. Pete McCloskey, kind of abandoned by a lot of Republicans, doesn't seen as a sacrificial lamb, only wins the state of Massachusetts, and that's because of his running mate John Volpe. And Reagan does beat him by a landslide to win re-election. Going in 1976, the Democrats nominate Vice President John Lindsay, who is the former mayor of New York City, and the Republicans nominate, I believe, Illinois Governor Charles Percy. I believe he's the governor of Illinois. John Lindsay doing very well in the South due to his running mate Jimmy Carter. Again, John Lindsay is running off the enormous Reagan economy, so Charles Percy really doesn't have much left in order to beat John Lindsay. He could attack him on his scandals from his time as New York City mayor, but that doesn't really do much damage to Lindsay. During his time, Lindsay does increase taxes, so similar to George H.W. Bush, he does increase taxes on a deal with the progressive Republicans in office. This is to make Lindsay look bad as it was to make Bush look bad. Lindsay passes a excuse me. He passes a late-term abortion ban in this time, which is all that he does. And he also tries to push for NAFTA, which is heavily actually, instead of it being a bipartisan issue, it's only pushed by the Democrats. It isn't pushed by Republicans. Republicans are actually really against the idea of NAFTA. And in 1980, John Anderson running an anti-NAFTA campaign. And yes, NAFTA does happen about 10, 20 years early in this timeline with Canada and Mexico. John Anderson kind of, runs as this progressive, populist, moderate kind of guy as he runs against John Lindsay, who's very unpopular. John Anderson beats John Lindsay 366 to 172. And the United States does get a trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. I've called this the NAFTA, the North American Mexico Canada, the North American Protectionist Trade Agreement. Sorry, I'm thinking of a different one. But NAFTA is passed, so and the American worker benefits from this. Um, and there is no Ross Perot going forward because Anderson would have taken care of that. We would have had a pretty great economy going forward. Anderson would have passed an assault weapons ban during his first term, and he would have passed a safe, legal, and rare abortion bill as well during his first term as president. Going on to 1984, the Democrats nominate, honestly, the best candidate to run against Anderson, and that is Ohio Senator and former astronaut John Glenn. However, Anderson's very popular. Glenn doesn't. Glenn does well in his home state and a couple southern states on the West Coast. Anderson ends up beating John Glenn. Not that anything John Glenn did wrong, is the fact that John Anderson was super popular. And then the second term, not much really happens. Of course, there is the problem with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union does collapse, which does give a boost to Anderson's approval ratings. Going on to 1988, the Democrats nominate Tennessee Senator Al Gore, keeping with the Southern establishment. And the Republicans nominate Vice President Patrick Lucey, which, fun fact, was a Democrat IRL, but he'd be a Republican in this timeline. Gore would defeat Patrick Lucey, and Gore, we see a lot of environmental pushes under the Democrats. Democrats would still be very environmentally sound, especially under Al Gore, and Republicans would essentially be in support of this. So environmentalism and protecting the climate and all that would be a bipartisan issue in this timeline. Gore would get a environmental policy overhaul bill passed as his big, big bill. We'd also see a recession, which does lead to another set of tax hikes, which makes Al Gore super unpopular, and we do get an assault weapons ban under Al Gore. Going on to 1992, Lyndon LaRouche would be running third party as this paleo-liberal third party candidate. And the Republicans nominate Ron Paul. And going forward, Republicans still remain economically progressive, but they take a socially liberal approach to things now. So they're liberal or libertarian, socially libertarian. I mean, libertarian progressive going forward, and Ron Paul kind of solidifies this transition. And Ron Paul, due to the third party split between LaRouche and Al Gore, Ron Paul ends up defeating Al Gore 327 to 211. And we would see an immigration overhaul with Ron Paul. We'd see a lot more of a libertarian approach, a bit more open borders while having a secure border, but this really doesn't last long. It lasts up until 2012, where the border begins to become super unhinged. But Ron Paul, the economy's doing good. We wouldn't see the Republican Revolution. We'd probably see something of a Democrat Revolution in 1994. Something like that. Maybe we'd get more paleo liberals in because of Lyndon LaRouche, but which only divides the party even more. But in 1996, the Democrats nominate Arkansas governor, or the former governor at this point, Bill Clinton. Lyndon LaRouche runs again, causing Bill Clinton to lose. Wait, is it the same margin? No, Bill Clinton actually outperforms Al Gore, but Ron Paul does defeat Bill Clinton 312 to 226 to win re-election. And Ron Paul has a pretty boring term here, nothing too special as we go on to 2000. Due to that boring term, Democrats would end up winning in 2000. As Texas Governor Ann Richards, she'd still be the governor in this time. She would go on against Vice President Barry Goldwater Jr. Yes, Barry Goldwater Jr. is the vice president. You thought I forgot about that, did you? I didn't. But Barry Goldwater Jr. Barely loses to Ann Richards. Ann Richards does beat him to become the 41st president and the first female president. So we had our first minority president and our first female president much, much sooner than we did IRL, and that's because of this whole progressive put by the Republicans. And in 2004, the Republicans nominate Rhode Island Senator Lincoln Chafee, continuing with this libertarian progressive approach. Chafee a lot more left-leaning than Ron Paul, but still very libertarian in the uh, long run. Ann Richards does beat Lincoln Chafee. Again, we probably 9/11 still happens. We go in the war in Afghanistan. We don't get a war in Iran, and Richards wouldn't have done that. That was a George Bush thing. Bush would have been the only person, or any neocon would have been the only people to have done that, because we must protect mud democracy and all that. But Ann Richards wouldn't have even thought about invading Iran. We would have just been in a war in Afghanistan, and that was about it. And going on to 2008, Ann Richards does pass away in late 2007, early 2008, and Bill Bradley does become the 42nd president. However, he isn't the nominee in 2008 because he was just super unpopular. Instead, it's going to be the UN ambassador under the Richards-Bradley administration, Richards-Bradley administration, and that's going to be Bill Richardson. Bill Richardson, the former New Mexico governor turned UN ambassador, will be running against Colorado governor Tom Tancredo, who, yes, I know, very far right IRL, but he'd be pretty much perfect for this libertarian progressive um, Republican Party. And yes, Barack Obama would be a Republican in this timeline. He'd be a very moderate, progressive kind of Republican, but of course he wouldn't win the primary because, the massive influx of libertarian white working class voters would back Tom Tancredo over Obama. Obama would do well with minority voters, so I might do a 2008 primary election night about this. This is actually a pretty interesting one. I might. You never know. If you want it. But yeah, Tom Tancredo, due to the Great Recession, which is backed by the Bill Bradley rather than Ann Richards, people will typically blame Bill Bradley. Jesus Christ, I can't talk. Will probably blame Bill Bradley for it rather than Ann Richards, which I don't blame them. But so Tom Tancredo would win in a landslide over Bill Richardson, who wouldn't have made any favors for himself since he was connected to the Ann Richards, Bill Bradley administration. I have a cat who's just rubbing against everything for attention, is knocking over this god-blessed lamp. It's pissing me off. Jesus Christ. This is the third time I put her in the floor. I was trying to ignore her, but she is just... Going on to 2012, we would have a very stacked Democrat primary, full of neoconservative Democrats and, a bunch of neocon Democrats, or at least moderate Democrats who you could say would become neocons in this timeline. So a lot of them. But they would nominate Wisconsin governor or senator. She's back. She's back. They would nominate Wisconsin Senator Russ Feingold as the nominee. And he'd do very well in the Rust Belt for a Republican. He'd win. He'd pretty much sweep the Rust Belt, which would be the first time in a long time, I think. Like, pretty much the first time since Ronald Reagan that a Democrat sweeps the Rust Belt, essentially. And I've got a cat on my shoulder, Jesus Christ. I am not Ash Ketchum. You were not a Pokemon. But Tom Tancredo would narrowly defeat Russ Feingold, and he would lose the popular vote here because Tom Tancredo would be unpopular. He'd have an approval rating in the mid to high 40s, from 45 to 48%, very low approval ratings, and he'd get by due to the amount of states he wins over Russ Feingold. Going on to 2016, the Democrats would nominate businessman Donald Trump. Donald Trump would never become a Republican due to the whole Obama birther thing. He would stay a Democrat because Obama was never a Democrat. He'd still be a birther theorist or whatever they're called, but Trump would become the nominee and bring in a whole new wave of left-wing nationalism to the party as neoconservatism does fall in this timeline right here. And Republicans would nominate Ted Cruz, libertarian populist, self-described, and he'd be kind of perfect for this party. And Bernie Sanders, who would not be caucusing with either party in the Senate, he'd be a pure independent, would be known as one of the most bipartisan senators in the Senate. He'd work across the aisle with both Democrats and Republicans on separate issues, and he'd be pretty popular. He'd take votes away from both Cruz and Trump. But Donald Trump does end up winning this election. He wins 296, 219 to 23, defeating both Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders to become the 43rd president. Going on to 2020, for some fucking reason, Bill Weld walks his way back into my videos. Bill Weld, the senator of Massachusetts, will go on to defeat Donald Trump. Again, we have COVID, we do have a secure border, and of course the riots would still happen. And I would imagine both Bill Weld and Donald Trump would have to take a heavy stance against the rioting from, these idiots that are rioting in the streets. And I do think we'd still have January 6th after the fact as well. And it would make Democrats and Donald Trump look bad afterwards. And Bill Weld would choose Oregon Governor Newt Bueller as his running mate. As Republican Senator Bill Weld would defeat Republican or Democrat President Donald Trump 282 to 256 to become the 43rd president. So, what did you guys think of the video? Did you like it? Am I rusty? I feel rusty. But thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is the Chaotic One saying, peace.